Doug Wead joins us now in studio, the author and historian of Game of Thrones. So I want to get your reaction. You've obviously seen what's taken place over the last couple weekends. This obviously much different than what we saw in Charlottesville. That being said, we're hearing the voices of thousands of people, and I want to get your take on the protest this afternoon.
Yeah, Elizabeth, my feeling is that many of the great emancipators of the 18th century, 19th century, 17th century would not be politically correct by today's standard. And that's too bad, because if society didn't take those initial early steps towards liberty and freedom, we wouldn't have it. There'd be no Barack Obama without George Washington. Right. And Abraham Lincoln, for example, by today's standards, when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he left 1 million slaves in bondage. And Washington had slaves. But those initial steps taken by Washington and Jefferson and others, they wanted Washington to be a king. And he said no, he wasn't going to be a king.
As this is happening, we often know the president spends his weekends, he's now in Bedminster up in New Jersey, still at his golf club, but he's been tweeting, and he just tweeted out this: Steve Bannon will be a tough and smart new voice at Breitbart News, maybe even better than before. Fake news needs the competition. And if you watch the more conservative websites during situations like this of what's happening in Boston, they will point out that a huge number of these groups are sort of paid protesters and or agitators who come out and pick fights with the police. We saw some video of that earlier. Doug, historical perspective for us. Have we ever seen a time in America where these sort of very small but very angry groups take over the national conversation in the way that Black Lives Matter and Antifa seem to have been able to do lately?
We've seen it in 1968. 140 cities in America, neighborhoods were burnt to the ground, tanks on the streets right here in Washington, D.C. So we've seen it before.
Well, right outside the State House there in Boston, you've got one of the SWAT vehicles from the Boston Police or one of the other agencies there that look an awful lot like tanks.
The tragedy is there's a little bit of a tinge of Red Guard in this. The Red Guard, the Mayo Red Guard, they wanted to purify things in China, and they went into the streets. The mobs went into the streets and yanked people out of automobiles and whipped them because they were stopping. They wanted them to go on red and stop on green because red was the color of the revolution. And they went into homes and killed pet cats and pet birds because they were consuming grain and people were starving. So when the mob takes over, the reason there's so many Robert E. Lee statues all over the South was he was the one guy the North and South could kind of agree was a moderating force. He ran schools for black children to teach them how to read out of his mansion, which was illegal. His wife and his mother smuggled slaves out of the Confederacy to Liberia, which was very controversial. So he tried to bring healing when the war was over. So that's why there was this proliferation of all these statues. In fact, for 35 years, Nancy Pelosi has walked by a statue of Robert E. Lee in the rotunda that was put there by Democratic lawmen. A Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House voted to make the Robert E. Lee dorm at West Point because he was one figure they could agree on.
My question is then, when does the conversation change to we need to remember these chapters in our history that are dark or make us uncomfortable, recognize some of the positives, as opposed to ignore them altogether?
Yeah, well, that was an issue that the president brought up. He said, where do you draw the line? Because certainly Washington had slaves. Andrew Jackson's statue is in Lafayette Park looking out the front door of the White House. You can see it. He's waving his hat. He had slaves. Thomas Jefferson had slaves. The old Greek, the cradle of democracy was Greece, but half of the population of that republic were slaves. The other half that were free included women who couldn't vote, they couldn't testify in a court of law, they weren't even counted in a census. So freedom takes these little tiny steps, and we need to recognize the steps they took, or we wouldn't arrive at the freedom we have.
Did these type of events help the conversation when you see this?
Well, I'll tell you what helps the conversation is you and Leland having a conversation while the American people watch this. If you weren't here, if there was no commentary, if there was no journalism left, and it was all up to these mobs, I hate to think what would happen.
We appreciate the shout out, Doug. Somehow the media has been brought into this as a player rather than, as you point out, an observer and contextualizer. But we'll try to offer a little more context. You said the last time you'd seen things like this was 1968, and that was a dark time in American history. How do we come back from here? Because politicians on both sides seem all too willing to fan the flames. The folks on the street seem all too willing to come back out and agitate. And the more attention that's paid to these fringe groups, the more they are emboldened. How do we come back from this as a country?
Boy, it's going to be hard, but I think a lot of people look to the president whether he will do it. If he gave a national address and he hit the right chord, he did it in Israel and Saudi Arabia. He did it to the joint session of Congress. If he could do it again now to the American people, it might bring some hope and healing. There are good people on both sides who understand that we need to get along with each other, and they appreciate the jobs that are coming. That's the best thing you can do for the issue of race. It's the best answer.
The timing is now for the president to do that?
The timing's now. He doesn't need to delay on that. America needs to hear it, and it needs to be very clearly sounded without a tweet that takes it back.
You know, I'm curious though, because we see with the White House and the political fallout, there's a lot of other distractions, and I'm wondering if focusing on a unity, a theme of unity, would really move the administration forward, and then in turn have a ripple effect, and we could perhaps see some legislative action.
I think you're right. People want to unite, and they want to believe. I don't think they want this hatred on either side. No one wants this. And the president could take a leadership. People would get behind him. People would forgive the things they did.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, too, because with tensions this high, you know, he does have some convincing to do. Whether or not you voted for him or not, there's a lot of people who didn't, and so he does have a lot of convincing to do. Can he accomplish that?
But I go back to that Jared Kushner event in Saudi Arabia and Israel. It was so profound. His speech back-to-back, Saudi Arabia and Israel, was so powerful and so profound that the world forgot everything he said up to that moment. And his speech to the joint session of Congress, the Democrats were stunned. They were ready to react to what they thought he would say, and he didn't. And they didn't know how to react to his performance. I think he could do it again.
Well, Doug, we can't tell you how much we appreciate not only your historical perspective, but the perspective of what's happening today in Boston. We've been watching for the better half of a couple hours what turned out to be a fairly peaceful protest in Boston.